Welcome to Chalk and Talk, a podcast about education and math. I'm Anna Stokke, a math professor and your host. Welcome to today's episode of Chalk and Talk. My guest today is Dr. Sarah Powell, an expert in teaching students who may face challenges with math. She's not only a leading researcher in her field, but also a passionate advocate for evidence-based practices in teaching math. This episode focuses on how we teach math to students who experience difficulties. We discuss the shortcomings of a recent joint position statement by the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, that's the NCTM, and the Council for Exceptional Children, that's the CEC. We explore why their recommendations fall short of addressing the needs of students with math difficulties and how critical evidence-based practices, such as systematic or explicit instruction, were glaringly absent. Sarah also provides actionable strategies backed by robust research that can make a real difference in students' math success. This conversation is about more than just teaching. It's about the ethical responsibility we have as educators, policymakers, and advocates to get math instruction right. Math is a cumulative subject, and every missed opportunity to teach it effectively compounds the challenges that students face later. We owe it to every child to provide the best possible instruction. As Sarah emphasizes, the evidence is readily available. It's a moral imperative to follow it. I hope you enjoy the episode. Just a note, we've included a copy of the NCTM CEC position statement, along with Sarah's group's response to it, on the resource page. You'll find other articles and resources mentioned in the episode there too. Now, without further ado, let's get started. It is an honor to have Dr. Sarah Powell with me today. And she is a professor in the Department of Special Education at the University of Texas at Austin. She has a PhD in special education from Vanderbilt University. She's a former kindergarten teacher. Her research focuses on supporting students who face challenges in mathematics. She develops and evaluates interventions for students with mathematics difficulties. She also conducts professional learning for teachers across the US and Canada, and she even spent 3 weeks in Australia in 2024 working with teachers there. She has won several awards for her research, such as the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers in 2019, and the Kirk Award for Outstanding Research Article from the Division for Learning Disabilities, Council for Exceptional Children in 2024. She helped lead a lot of the early efforts around conversations about the science of math. And I've been meaning to have Sarah on for a while, and I'm really excited to talk to her today. Welcome, Sarah. Welcome to my podcast.
Thank you so much, Anna. I feel this is a situation where I can be like long-time listener, first-time caller. So I'm really excited to be here today, and I'm glad we could make this work. And I am quite excited to talk about our topic for today.
So we'll get right into that. So there are a few things we want to talk about, but we're going to start with a discussion on a joint position statement that was recently released by the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, that's the NCTM, and I've talked about them on the podcast before. And it's a joint statement between the NCTM and the Council for Exceptional Children, CEC, and the statement is on the teaching of mathematics to students with disabilities.
Yes.
The statement references the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which guarantees that students identified with a disability are entitled to a free, appropriate public education that ensures access to the general curriculum. Now, this joint position statement outlines a series of actionable recommendations for supporting students with disabilities in mathematics. However, you led the writing of a response letter that critiques that statement, calling it inadequate.
I did, yes.
Your letter points out that many of the recommendations are based on beliefs and philosophies, while key research-based methods are omitted. So let's discuss where that position statement falls short, and let's actually explore some evidence-based strategies for effectively teaching math to students with disabilities, a very important topic. So, first off, for those who might be unfamiliar, can you just explain what disabilities in math can look like in the classroom and what challenges students with disabilities typically face when learning math?
Yeah, that's a great question, Anna. So it is estimated that about 3 to 7% of students in the school population likely have what we will call a math disability. So here in the United States, that's often identified and called a quote specific learning disability unquote. And then those students have individualized education program goals in math. Sometimes in the United States, and sometimes a lot of times out of the United States, people call this dyscalculia, which is the math version of dyslexia for reading. And so when students have a math disability, they can struggle with a lot of different aspects of mathematics, whether those that is related to number and operations, that could also be related to how students work with geometry or measurement. A lot of students that have a math disability also experience difficulty with word problem solving. And so, really, what we see is that these students, for the most part, just have persistent challenges in mathematics. But I will say, even though this statement that we're going to talk about today is focused on students with an identified math disability, there's a large group of students in the United States, as well as Canada and in many other areas of the world, that experience what I would consider math difficulty. And so those are students that don't have an identification of a disability, but do show that they're having a hard time with math. And so I think that this position statement is really important not only for students with disabilities, but also for students who are in that gray zone. They're having some math difficulty. Their teacher likely needs to provide more math support than is currently being provided. And so many of the quote actionable recommendations, unquote, that we could talk about today would be important for students with math disabilities as well as students who are experiencing math difficulty.
Okay, so we're actually talking about a very large group of students that would be affected by some of these recommendations, right?
Yeah, in the United States at grade 4, it's about 64% of kids that show that they're having difficulty with math. And I think it's a pretty similar number of students in Canada and in places like Australia and other places around the world. So it's a lot of students.
And my guess is it might even increase as you move up the grades. Would I be right?
You're exactly right. Yeah, by grade 8, we see that it's around like 68, 70% of students in the United States that don't meet this, what we would consider a minimum level of math proficiency. And then by grade 12, it's about 75% of students. And I'll tell you, Anna, and you know this, but these quote minimum levels of math proficiency, unquote, are typically pretty low bars. And so this means that the majority of students in schools in the US and in Canada and other places are not showing even the minimum level of math proficiency needed to go on and be successful in the next grade level or as they exit school and go into college or career.
Because of this, it seems like a great idea that we might get this position statement from the NCTM and CEC. So you read it, and what were your initial thoughts when you read the position statement?
Yeah, so a little background knowledge. So I would say about 16, 18 months ago, a colleague of mine called me and they had some questions for me about research in the area of math difficulty and disability. And they were on the committee. And I texted them yesterday and asked if it was okay to say that somebody had talked to me. And they said it was yes, yes. And they really had some questions saying, like, oh, we've been talking about this at this panel. Do you know of a research base to support X or Y? And is there anything that we might not be talking about at this panel that you think might be helpful for kids with a math disability? So I knew this was on my radar, but I didn't see anything. I didn't really know about conversations that were going on until in September of 2024. I received an email from the Council for Exceptional Children, or CEC, and it said, there's this position statement from NCTM and CEC. Right now, this is a first draft, and we would like feedback on this. And so I opened it up and I read it, and I had about an hour open in my calendar, which is a little unusual. And I wrote a response to it, and I have it here. Your viewers can't see it, but I wrote 10 things that I thought would be important to include in such a position statement that weren't included. And I submitted my feedback online and I actually signed my name to it. It said they were looking for anonymous feedback, but I said, I'm Sarah Powell. This is my feedback. If you have any questions, please reach out. And so that was in September. And then I believe it was early December, I started to see on social media this statement has been released. So I was like, oh, I wonder how much feedback they took from me and other people to put together with this statement. And when I opened it up, I would say I was pretty disappointed because the statement that was released in December seemed to be almost identical to the statement that I saw an early draft of in September. And again, it just had a lot of things in it that I would say teeter more toward beliefs rather than research based practices or evidence. And I felt that the actionable recommendations for teachers were very underdeveloped and not really helpful at all. I think I actually referred to this statement as a fluff statement. And so that's where we are today.
Maybe you should summarize some of the key recommendations in that position statement.
Yeah. So, in the position statement, which I'm sure you will link in your podcast, and it's also pretty easy to find online. The first part is they have three bulleted items that they say are really important. So, one is that students with disabilities have a right to access and be provided with appropriate supports to be successful with grade level math content. I do not disagree with that at all. My second bullet point is that students with disabilities have a right to high quality instruction. Totally agree. And a third bullet point is that students with disabilities have a right to be supported by educators who believe in their abilities. Great. I think all of those things are important. Anna, what do you think?
I agree.
All right. But then as we go into more of the detail, so on the second page, it starts to talk about high quality, and they actually use the term research based instruction. And it's really interesting to me that they say that students should receive research based instruction, yet put together a statement that is, I would say, fairly light on research. But they talk a lot about the importance of students with disabilities getting into grade level standards and having instruction on grade level content. And I agree. I wholeheartedly agree that students should be working on grade level content. Yet there's the next sentence that says limiting students to below grade level content will not improve outcomes towards mathematics proficiency. Now, I would agree that we don't want to only do below grade level content, but as I have listened on your podcast a number of times, so many people, including yourself, including myself, talk about how math is cumulative. And I cannot just work on grade level standards with a seventh grader if they're still having difficulty with multiplication, with division, with fractions. And the way this reads, it's almost as, and it doesn't go beyond that. What I read to you was basically all it said there is that we shouldn't be working on below grade level content. And it really, for many students, it has to be a meaningful combination of unfinished learning content and grade level standards. It can't just be grade level standards. And then as it continues, digs into UDL, which we will probably talk about on this podcast. And it talks about use of representations. It talks about multi-tiered systems of support. That's a big thing in special education. That's great. But then as we get to the actionable recommendations, this for me was where I felt that this statement was just completely underwhelming. So they have some actionable recommendations. The first are for teacher educators and state education departments. The first is that they require special ed majors to take a minimum of one mathematics method course. It doesn't say whether that should be a special ed math methods course or a general ed math methods course, or maybe a combination of that. But then the second bullet point says to require general education majors to have field based learning opportunities to teach mathematics to students with disabilities, but no course on it. And so I don't understand why there would be course related expectations for pre service teachers in special education, but not the same expectations for teachers in general education. Because as we all know, general education teachers are the people who are providing most, if not all, of the math instruction to students with disabilities. So we've got some stuff there. Then I really had some, I'll say, issues with the actionable recommendations for general education and special education teachers of mathematics. So the first, there's 8 bullet points here. Is it okay if I talk about all of them?
Absolutely. Go for it.
Okay. All right. Let's do it. All right. So the first says to incorporate Universal Design for Learning framework and unit and lesson planning. Well, Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, is a big thing that's talked about in special education. Yet the evidence base for UDL, I would suggest, is very underwhelming. And there have been some really good articles written on this pretty recently about UDL. So the idea with UDL is that students should be engaged in instruction that really is individualized to the student and meets students' needs. And there's these areas of like engagement, representation, and expression. So maybe students have different ways that they can engage with their learning. But as a recent meta analysis showed by Zhang et al. In 2024, it's very unclear what the definition of UDL is. It's very hard to quantify when teachers are actually implementing UDL. And it's almost impossible to measure UDL. And I know one of your previous podcasts with Brian Ponce, he talked about this whole thing and he said something like, if you can't quantify it, then you can't measure it. And if you can't measure it, you can't understand the impact. And that is totally what UDL is. And there's another really nice article by Boyson, also in 2024, that kind of warned that UDL somewhat starts to cross over into learning style territory, which we know is an educational myth. And so there's just like a lot of uneasiness as to what exactly UDL is. And it's not what I would say is a research-based recommendation for teachers, or B, an actionable thing for teachers to do. So that's the first bullet point. The second bullet point talks about use of representations. And that is actually one of the research-based practices that has been identified time and time again for students with math. So cool. Third says to plan proactively using a preventative model for instruction. I interpret that as something related to multi-tiered systems of support, or RTI, response to intervention. And that is important. Students need to have core instruction and then supplemental instruction when necessary. So, okay, great. But I'll tell you, schools' implementation of MTSS is very hard because it's very expensive and it's also a hard structure to put into place. So it's not easy for everybody to do that. Fourth thing that they said was that position students with disabilities as valuable owners and contributors of the mathematics being learned. There's a lot of ways we could go with this. I would kind of go like a growth mindset way, which I think we would agree like having a growth mindset is helpful, but there's not a lot of research that says that improves math outcomes. There's a really great study by Lynn Fuchs and colleagues in 2021 where they did fraction intervention with kids, and then half of the kids in the fraction intervention received also a growth mindset activity each day. And what they learned at post test is that there was no difference on the fraction outcomes whatsoever, whether you received or did not receive the growth mindset activity each day. And so, really, the best way to help students see themselves as learners and owners of mathematics is to teach mathematics instead of to do all this other stuff. I'll pause there, Anna, to see if you have any comments so far, and then we can get to the other four bullet points.
Well, I do have some comments. So, first of all, well, I mean, I was quite curious about the UDL stuff because I hear about UDL a lot, but I didn't actually know what it was.
It's very hard to define what UDL is. And most teachers, when you talk to them, they'll say, like, oh, I'm doing those things. And I agree. And I think that's the problem with UDL is like, well, what is it exactly? And in that Zhang et al. 2024 article, they talk about, well, we need to have these checkpoints to say, like, this is exactly what UDL is. And there's just not a lot of real hard evidence to say that when teachers do UDL, it leads to improved student outcomes.
I will post that paper that you talked about on UDL. I also hadn't heard about the Fuchs paper on growth mindset. And so I'm going to post that. I'm going to post that for my listeners. So that's really helpful to know. Of course, yeah, absolutely. The best way to get good at math and end up having a good mindset about math is just to actually learn math, right?
Yep. We have to teach the math. Yes, agreed.
Let's keep going. What else have you got there?
So then it continues. The fifth bullet point about actionable recommendations for teachers is to provide paired time for students to share and rehearse their thinking and ideas in multimodal ways before moving to a whole group discussion. There's a lot in that sentence right there. And there's not a lot of research that says that students have to share and rehearse their thinking before engaging in whole group discussion. But yeah, probably helpful for students, but not a strong evidence base. Six, it talks about providing a variety of interactive learning experiences. I pulled out my notes from the first time I read this and I wrote next to it, what? Question mark. Like, I don't even understand what that means. And without further explanation, I don't know if a lot of teachers would understand what that means. Seventh, it says use flexible grouping structures to cultivate a community of learning. Again, this just seems a little wishy-washy. Sure, let's have students work with different students, but what is a community of learning? I need more information. And then finally, it says build meaningful recommend or connections between concepts and procedures. And I wrote here, okay, sure, how? And that's it, Anna. Those are the 8 bullet point recommendations for general education and special education teachers of mathematics. There's other stuff in here for policymakers, for school and district leadership, for grant agencies. Great. But I think we should focus on the recommendations for teachers and not only what is there, but what is not there. And I think that's what got a lot of people, including myself, a little riled up. And that's why I wrote a response to this position statement because of the absence of things on those actionable recommendations.
So if I'm understanding correctly, so first of all, we have this list of recommendations which are billed as actionable, but they're actually not really that actionable because in a lot of cases, you don't even know what they mean.
Yeah, use representations. Okay, I got it. The other 7, I'm not really sure how I would do that as a math teacher in the classroom and whether that would contribute to improved outcomes for students with disabilities.
So the next thing is they're billed as research based. Everything in education is always billed as research based, just so we know. But we have to figure out what actually is research based and what actually isn't research based because we don't, when someone says that, we don't know if it's true. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing is that really important things that have a strong research base for working with children with disabilities in mathematics were omitted from this statement, right?
Yes, very much so.
So let's talk about that. Can you provide some specific examples of where it really falls short?
I think your comment about everything is research based is something that I think about a lot. And I know based on listening to your podcast and talking to you previously, I feel like you think about that a lot too. And I know that there's different types of research that contribute to different types of evidence, but there are types of research that have been replicated again and again and again and again. And those are some of the things that I would suggest we rely on. Like if we it didn't just work one time, it didn't just work 10 times, but we've seen that 100 studies have used representations to help students understand fractions better. Well, my gosh, we should probably be using representations to help students understand fractions better, right? In special education, there's a lot of research related to math. And I would say there's a lot of very high quality research that's been conducted in this area, not just in the last decade, but over the last several decades. And so there are quite a few meta analyses. So, a meta analysis is a study of other studies that can come to some conclusions. And we will see that a lot of meta analyses say that students should be engaged in, I'll say, explicit instruction so that they can understand foundational content in math. There's meta-analyses that have showed that use of representations, hands-on manipulatives, or there's a meta-analysis recently about virtual manipulatives, that's been helpful at improving the math outcomes for students. And some of this literature has been conducted with students with an identified disability in math. A lot of this literature is in that zone of math difficulty where some of the students might have an identified disability, but many of the students do not. But if we pull from those 2 areas of research, there's quite a bit that we can rely on. And I could go over a lot of different meta analyses, but there's a practice guide from the US Department of Education that came out in 2021 that does a pretty good job of putting together what are some of the research validated practices that are important for the teaching of math when kids experience difficulty with math, which I would say that's kids with a math disability and kids with math difficulty. And there they outline 6 practices that have a strong evidence base to support their use. And I use the word strong because that is the exact word, that's the exact terminology from that IES practice guide. And in fact, they identified that all 6 of these practices have a quote, strong, unquote, evidence to support their use. And that's a little interesting because there are 4 other practice guides in math from the US Department of Ed. There's one about word problem solving, one about fractions, one about algebra, and one about early math. And they have varying levels of evidence. They will say either minimum, moderate, or strong level of evidence. And this is the only math practice guide where all 6 have a very strong level of evidence to support their use. So you're probably asking, well, what are the 6 practices, right? I'll get there. So in the practice guide, they talk about the following things. First, and I'm going to do them out of order from the practice guide because this is usually the order that I talk to teachers about these. First is that we need to make sure that students have a lot of opportunities to learn the language of math. So we can think about that as the symbolic language of math. I know Daniel Ansari talked about that when he was on your podcast, but I think a lot of that is around the vocabulary of math. Like, do students understand the words and terms that are used to explain and communicate in mathematics? Second and third is that students need to use a variety of representations to understand the concepts and procedures of math. So, those are those hands on tools, virtual tools, graphic organizers, drawings to really help connect things to that abstract form of mathematics. And connected to that, third, is students need to have a lot of practice with number lines, both number lines with whole numbers and then importantly, number lines related to rational number understanding so that students understand the magnitude of number. So we've got vocabulary, representations, number line. Fourth practice that has a very strong research base to support its use is this idea of explicit instruction. Some people call this systematic instruction or direct instruction. In the practice guide, it uses the terminology systematic. A lot of people out in the world call this explicit instruction. I often refer to this as modeling and practice. But the idea is that we need to model mathematics and give students a lot of opportunities to practice mathematics while keeping them engaged, asking a lot of questions, getting them to be highly engaged in both the model and practice, and then giving a lot of feedback to that engagement. And then fifth in the practice guide, they talk about this idea of building fluency. They talk about it doing timed activities with fluency. I know Brian Ponce talked about that on your podcast. I would suggest just building fluency. And that fluency is that ease and accuracy in math. So that's important. And then sixth, they talk about a focus on word problem solving, which maybe a podcast for another day is my favorite thing to talk about, but that students need really good strategies for word problem solving and so on. So they talk about those 6 evidence based practices that have a strong level of evidence to support their use. Yet, Anna, only one of those is mentioned in this NCTM CEC position statement. What do you think about that?
Well, I know which one it is, and it's consistent with sort of the things that I've noticed over, many years, recommendations coming from organizations such as NCTM.
Yeah. And why do you think we see representations so often? Why do you think that is?
It's because of these kinds of recommendations, right?
Yeah. Well, and not that representations are easy, but I think there's some of the lower hanging fruit. It's harder to get into, well, how do we teach this math content? It's much harder to get into word problem solving. And so, like representations, oh yeah, like let's use some manipulatives, let's do some drawing, let's use a number line. That's a good start, but that's not everything. And that's just a small piece of the math learning puzzle for students. And so, while it's listed in the actionable recommendations as use representations, I say great. But what about these other things that have a really strong evidence base to support their use? Particularly, and I think the one around explicit instruction, a lot of people that I talk to kind of got bent out of shape that explicit instruction in a document for students with disabilities was not mentioned at all. And that just seems, and I used it in my rebuttal statement, and I think I called it, quote, educational malpractice, unquote. And I do think, especially from an organization such as the Council for Exceptional Children, that we are doing our students a disservice by not talking about the role of explicit instruction in the learning of math.
So, why do you think explicit instruction was omitted?
Probably for a lot of reasons. There were panelists that got together to put together these recommendations. And I understand it was a panelist of people who represented general education and special education. And there's a lot of talk out in the math community about explicit instruction and whether or not it's a helpful thing and whether or not we should be doing it at all. And, I remember Daniel Ansari on your podcast talked about these false dichotomies. And I think it's not an either or, like we should do explicit instruction or we should do inquiry instruction. No, it's really a continuum. But it's like, when should we do this? And I see that explicit instruction is really foundational for learning anything new in mathematics. And until you have, I would say, a proficiency with that content in mathematics, you really can't move to engaging in tasks that revolve more around inquiry. I remember when Brian Ponce was on your podcast, he said, you can't start at the top to get to the top. And I was like, Brian, that's exactly right. There is a role for explicit instruction, but there's some conversations in the math ed community where they just don't really embrace explicit instruction in the way that special education embraces explicit instruction, or I would even say like cognitive science or educational psychology have embraced explicit instruction.
So, why is systematic explicit instruction so crucial for teaching math to students with difficulties in math?
Explicit instruction is modeling that comes from the teacher. That modeling has to be engaging with the student. So this is not just teacher talk. This is not just what a lot of people will call the I do, but it's a model for how to solve a specific type of problem. And the students are engaged in that model. And then the other big part of explicit instruction is that there's practice opportunities. I always suggest that students aren't learning math until they're practicing mathematics. The model kind of sets you up for success, but the practice is where that learning of mathematics occurs. And so in explicit instruction, students are engaged in a lot of practice opportunities. A lot of that is guided practice where the teacher and students are practicing the same problem. Some of that might be peer to peer practice. Some of that might be independent practice. And all of the time, when students are engaged in that modeling and engaged in that practice, teachers are asking a lot of questions to help with engagement. Students are responding frequently. Our typical rule of thumb when we design intervention is that students have to be responding at least every 30 seconds, or else you're losing their attention. And then we're giving a lot of feedback. We're giving affirmative feedback to those responses and corrective feedback. But it's just this combination of modeling and practice with those supports for engagement that lead to a very active learning opportunity for students. And so when we think about explicit instruction, I think about modeling, practice, and that engagement. And what's interesting about explicit instruction is we're talking about math here today because this is a math podcast and you like math and I like math. But explicit instruction, the conversations are alive and well about explicit instruction related to reading, how students learn to read. How do students learn to write? It's very helpful for them to model and practice there. How do students learn reading comprehension in science or social studies? There's a lot of explicit instruction that goes on there. And in fact, the Council for Exceptional Children has really talked a lot about explicit instruction. A few years ago, they put together first a set of 22 what they call high leverage practices, or HLPs. They've now kind of come out with version 2 where they have like these 6 big pillar high leverage practices. And Gina Nelson and colleagues in 2022 did a meta-analysis of the 22 HLPs that were recognized by the Council for Exceptional Children as being high leverage practices for students with disabilities. And the high leverage practice that had the single strongest research base was explicit instruction. So much so that when CEC just released their revised high leverage practices with their 6 pillar practices, explicit instruction is one of the pillar practices. So to see the Council for Exceptional Children have all this documentation about how important explicit instruction is, yet a joint statement produced by the Council for Exceptional Children not saying anything, not one lick about explicit instruction, to me goes back to my quote that I talked to you about a little bit earlier, does seem like educational malpractice.
It also seems strange, right? If they have a lot of other documents that suggest that explicit instruction is really important, it's odd that they would sign off on a position statement, a joint position statement that excluded it.
Yeah, and really in the actionable recommendations, and I think that's where the explicit instruction could be helpful. Like, oh, to teach this grade level math content or to help students with unfinished learning from content in previous grade levels, well, you should be modeling and practicing. The statement doesn't give teachers anything to go on. And I think the statement was probably trying to avoid a lot of these conversations around explicit instruction or, inquiry-based learning. And then in doing so, they just give you what I would consider a nothing statement. But I'm a little worried, and I think other people are too, that this nothing statement is going to be passed around at state departments to be, oh, are we doing these things in mathematics for kids with disabilities? Oh, we are? Okay, great. We're done. Like, we're fine. I think it's going to be passed around at school districts. It's probably going to be a driving factor for professional learning coming up this summer or and into the fall for teachers. Oh, we got to make sure that all of our teachers have read this statement and are doing these things. I'm worried that this is going to be passed around in pre-service teacher coursework or in coursework for like alternatively certified teachers. Oh, do you want to know how to teach math to students with disabilities? Here, read this 8-page statement that doesn't say anything. And so we're not really helping teachers by producing this statement. There's other things that we could be doing and saying that I think would actually help teachers understand how to teach math to students with disabilities. And then subsequently, which is the most important thing, improve the math outcomes for students with disabilities.
Absolutely. And another interesting thing, like What Works Clearinghouse. So this practice guide has come up on a few previous episodes.
It has. Yeah, I've heard it mentioned before.
Yeah, like with Amanda Vanderhayden, et cetera. And this is a high quality review. And What Works Clearinghouse and IES are very reputable organizations. Like it was a panel of experts that put together these recommendations based on the highest quality research.
Well, and they read dozens and dozens of studies. And I think the thing about all the practice guides is that the front part is a nice, easy read. But then if you go toward the back of the practice guides, they go into, oh, we identified 13 studies that had a moderate level of evidence or a strong level of evidence. And they actually list the studies. And someone on that panel, and probably multiple people, have read all of those studies to decide how that practice makes its way into the practice guide. So I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but that the What Works Clearinghouse practice guide that I talked about with those 6 practices, they reviewed, I mean, dozens and dozens of studies. And the thing that I see in the position statement from NCTM and CC, they do cite the research that they included, but a lot of this research comes from books. Books are typically not peer reviewed, so I would not really count on a book as an evidence based practice. A lot of the articles that they actually cite aren't about math, but they're more about like teacher affect or teacher goals. And they cite some of their own stuff. So there's some CEC documents that are cited, and there's some NCTM documents that are cited. But I would suggest that the reference list for this position statement is very, very light, considering there are hundreds of studies out there about how to support the mathematics of students with math disability or students that have math difficulty.
And so do you think NCTM doesn't know about What Works Clearinghouse?
Oh, I think they know about the What Works Clearinghouse. I will say that the colleague that talked to me early about this NCTM position statement, they said that one of the earlier meetings, it was emphasized that not all NCTM statements always have to rely on research. And I'll just put that out there and let your listeners digest that information as they will. But I just see that we've got to do better. Teachers are trying their best. Teachers don't have a lot of time to plan, and they just want to know, what do I want to do tomorrow to help this kid who's struggling with math? And to put out stuff that isn't relying on research, we just have to do better. That's really shortchanging teachers. And then ultimately, that's shortchanging kids.
Absolutely. And on that note, what are the potential consequences for students with disabilities when evidence based practices are not prioritized in policy or guidance?
Yeah, Anna, this is where it gets makes me really frustrated, but and really sad. I think like math is so cumulative. I know you've talked about that before, but everything that you do in math at an earlier time point impacts your later math. And that's one of the reasons earlier we talked about, well, yeah, I want to be on grade level standards, but if I have some unfinished learning from earlier content, I have to go back and work on that before I move back to my grade level standards. And because math is cumulative, we need to make sure that we are always providing our best set of instructional practices to students. And if they get a weak year of math instruction, or like if they're not getting the math instruction that's necessary, or maybe their teacher is using instructional practices that don't actually have an evidence base to support their use, then students might miss out on maybe a year of math content. And that's going to have implications for the following year and the following year. And so time is really of the essence. We already know that these students are struggling with math. We cannot waste their time using practices that we believe are helpful, but don't have an evidence to base to support their use. And we can't just keep passing students on from one grade level to the next, because what happens is their math gap widens. If they don't do well with addition and subtraction, that's going to have implications for multiplication and division. If you have a hard time with multiplication and division, typically you might experience difficulty with fractions. Many times, Julie Booth describes fractions as like that early gatekeeper to algebra. And so, because of the cumulative nature of mathematics, we have to teach math. We have to teach it now. We have to teach it with evidence based practices so that students can go on to be successful in math, or else we're just letting students get set up for failure. And that's frustrating. And that's what makes me sad, because that's what's going on in a lot of schools right now. Like, how do you see it play out?
Well, I see it play out as in someone might want to use explicit instruction, or they might be using explicit instruction, and someone would bring this position statement and say, look, that is not on this list. You should be doing these other things. There should be group work. Like group work was one of the recommendations, right?
Yeah. I mean, is there a teacher though that doesn't have their students doing group work at some point in the day? And I think some teacher would be like, "Oh yeah, I'm doing that. Oh yeah, I'm doing that. I'm yeah doing that. Oh, I'm doing all these things." But it's like, well, these aren't actually the things that are going to move the dial in terms of improved student math outcomes.
How influential do you think these two groups are? Like, how influential is NCTM, for instance, in shaping educational practices in math?
Yeah. Oh, I wish I had data on this. I see that the NCTM in the United States is super influential. So there's a lot of conversations on social media about them. They run a very large conference here in the United States, and they put out a lot of books and documents, some that are downloadable for free, many of which you have to pay for. But I mean, they're an organization that exists because people pay money to go to their conferences and buy the things that they sell. And so the more that they're putting out, I would almost wonder if there's a planned book to come from this position statement or something like that, and people will buy it. That's how that organization exists. And a lot of people talk about like the NCTM standards, and usually in the same sentence is like the Common Core, and things that lead national conversations here in the United States about math. The CEC in the United States, the Council for Exceptional Children, they too run a very large yearly conference that typically has thousands of special education teachers from all over the United States and world that attend it. They publish a lot of books themselves. And that's how they stay in business, through their conferences and through the things that they sell. And so I would suggest that in Math United States, NCTM is probably the lead conversationalist, and probably in special education in the United States, the Council for Exceptional Children is the lead conversationalist. So to have these two people together, I love that they want to get together and put this position statement together. But what came from it is pretty big disappointment.
Okay, so if you were to rewrite that position statement, what would it include? Would it include the 6 recommendations from the practice guide?
We would just go to a lot of those research validated practices. We could start with the IES practice guides. There are 5 of them. The one I talked about in depth, I think, would be a good one to start, because that's more about instructional strategies. And then the other 4 talk about important content that we should be teaching as we focus on early math, fractions, word problem solving, and algebra. There's also, as I said, a lot of meta analyses out there that we could rely on to say what are the practices we see used time and time again that contribute to positive and improved student outcomes. So I would start there. I think we are going to work on writing a peer reviewed article about some of those actionable items. And there are already a lot of resources out there, starting with the What Works Clearinghouse practice guides. So teachers have some information at their fingertips, just knowing where those resources are and then how to weight those resources against something like this position statement. That's one of the things that I think is important for us to be talking about right now.
What can educators and advocates who prioritize research based methods do to counteract or circumvent the potential impacts of the position statement?
That's a good question. So I get the opportunity to talk with a lot of teachers across the US and other countries as well, and just helping them understand here are 6 evidence-based practices you should consider using as you teach math to kids who struggle with math. And how can you use those alongside your current math materials? If they're adopting a new textbook series, how are those 6 research validated practices addressed in that textbook series? But I also think it's important for caregivers and parents to be aware of this. I do get the opportunity probably once or twice every week to talk to parents and caregivers. Many times their child has recently been identified with a math disability or dyscalculia, and they find my name and they want to say, like, well, what should I be looking for? And I'll say, well, here's this really great practice guide. Talk to the special ed teacher and the general ed teacher. How are they addressing these 6 instructional components as they teach math to your child? How are you seeing this reflected in your students' IEP, their individualized education program? And so I think just knowledge is helpful to take to the classroom or to the classroom teacher. But I will say, in terms of, I kind of just talked about textbooks and materials, textbooks and materials are important. I think the most prevalent question I get asked is which program should we buy? and I think everybody wants to just buy something and be done with it.
Can I say one not to buy? Oh, I'm just joking.
You'll say it. I always say, like, I'll say, like, program agnostic because I really tried not to provide recommendations. But you buy program X or program Y or program Z, or your school already owns A, B, or C, and that's helpful. But it's more important how those materials are used. And you know how those materials are used? How are you emphasizing vocabulary? How are you using representations and number lines to help students understand the content? How are you explicitly teaching the content? How are you building fluency on the content? And how are you helping students problem solve with that content? And no program does that for you. That's the teaching part of mathematics. And so relying on those research validated instructional strategies, that's the secret sauce. And that's where we really need to focus. And it would have been nice if this position statement had said those things.
So you gave some really good advice there, and I'm just going to repeat that. And I think a teacher could do this or a parent could do this. So you have who are struggling, they have difficulty with math, they're not progressing as they should. Get that practice guide. We're going to link to it on the resource page. If you're a parent, take it to the teacher and say, how are you implementing these things to help my child? If you're a teacher and, someone's leaning on you to use methods that you think are not really working, you could go to the principal and say, look, this is from the What Works Clearinghouse. It's a very reputable organization. These are evidence-based practices that I should be using with my class. And I want to ask another question related to that IES practice guide. And so I've mentioned that to a lot of people. And sometimes people will say, oh, that's not for a general class. It says right here, this is for students who struggle with math only. So what do you think about that?
Well, we talked about this just a little bit earlier. Here in the US, we're seeing that the majority of students don't meet a minimum level of math proficiency. So, around 64, 65% of students in grade 4. So, if I imagine a classroom of 20 students, I would just guess that probably 12 or 13 of them aren't going to meet a minimum level of math proficiency. So if 13 of my 20 students aren't going to meet the end of year benchmark that has been set by my district or my state, well, I would say those 13 students have math difficulty. And Anna, it's a little sad, but I work with some school districts. Well, they'll say 93% of our kids didn't meet a minimum level of math proficiency. So, my goodness, that means that in your core or your general education instruction, we better be doing these things that support students that have that difficulty with math. I think there's probably very few classrooms in the United States that would not benefit from the use of these practices, because a lot of these practices are things that aren't just helpful for students that experience difficulty with math, but are really helpful for all learners of math.
And would you say also that maybe they're effective for making sure that a student doesn't end up having difficulty with math or get classified as a student with a disability in math? Because what we actually want to do is prevent that, right? We want to get the instruction right from the get go for those students.
Yeah, I love that you bring that up. And I feel that that's where my research is in this whole idea of prevention science. So we do a lot of research around fractions and word problem solving. We work with general education students in general education classrooms. But these are students that exhibit difficulty with fractions or word problem solving. And what we're trying to do is go in and help them with that content so that they don't continue to struggle, so that they may not be later identified with a learning disability in the area of mathematics. So I'm so glad you bring up that idea of prevention, because a little bit of prevention, we do it now, especially like early prevention in preschool, kindergarten, first grade, then we're going to alleviate more math difficulty that could occur later on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just find it really surprising that any of this would be controversial. As you were talking about this, I kind of get the idea of what might have happened here is perhaps it was like a compromise statement.
I feel that there is a lot of that going on, a lot of compromise, but in some ways, then it's like, well, then why do we have to put out something at all? Because there are already documents out there that have done background search on the research and have synthesized the research in a meaningful way. And so, in many ways, like, well, did we really need this statement? What are we going to do about it moving forward?
And I mean, it's just not about that, right? Like, it's not about compromise.
No, it's about what's important for kids.
Precisely. It's what you said. It's educational malpractice. It could be considered educational malpractice and frankly unethical.
Well, and one thing I think is interesting, and I put this in my response statement, but I said, there's given the strong research base in special education about mathematics, I don't think that anyone would argue that that is not true. There's a focus in the CEC teacher preparation standards about the use of research validated practices. If you actually look at the CEC standards for teacher prep, they say that teachers need to be aware of research validated practices. And there's also a focus in both general education and special education legislation about the use of research validated practices. So we've got a lot of research in special ed. The teacher preparation standards in CEC say that we should be using research validated practices, and legislation says that we should be using research validated practices. Yet this position statement is very light on research based practices or research validated practices. And so I say, this position statement falls well short of any expectation that we would have for a joint statement from these two organizations.
100%. So maybe your group could give a presentation at the next NCTM conference on evidence based practices.
There are some interesting things coming up here, Anna. So CEC has their yearly conference. It's in March and it's in Baltimore, Maryland this year, coming up in just 2 months from now. And there's a presentation on the books about this statement. And I believe some people from NCTM and from CEC are going to be there. So I plan to go. I'm not going to be rude, but I might have some copies of our rebuttal to the position statement available for people to peruse and read. And then the next NCTM is in the fall. I'm not sure if I'm going to attend that conference. I attended NCTM. Well, I went last year and it was fine, but I attended 2 years ago and I was invited to come and give a talk on what's important to teach math to kids with disabilities, interestingly. And I talked about explicit instruction. And I kid you not, there was a not loud, but a light boo from someone in the group. And at that point, when I showed the slide about explicit instruction, 8 people got up and walked out of the room. I can tell you this story now because I've now shared it with a lot of people and I can now almost laugh about it. But I'll tell you at the time it happened, it wasn't laughable. And I did cry about that because I felt like I'm in a research space sharing research and you walk out of the room. And I thought that that was very rude on a presentation for students with disability. I wasn't talking about doing this in the general education classroom, although, as we talked about, would be helpful. So I'm not sure how welcome a presentation at NCTM would be, but if I do get the opportunity, if I get the invite, I will be there, and I will continue to talk to people like you and other people, and continue to work with teachers and districts and states to really try to inform what are the best practices for teaching math to students who experience difficulty with math.
Yeah, so I'm sorry that happened to you. That's a sad state of affairs, and I've definitely been in those situations before.
Well, and I will say it was a large room that I was in, and about 8 people got up and walked out. There were over 100 people that stayed. There were people that emailed me afterward wanting resource after resource. People came and talked to me, "Thank you so much for coming. I need to do this with my students." And so the positivity in the room was much greater than the negativity, but sometimes the negativity seems to have the loudest voice. And and I can't even imagine going to a special ed conference where people would boo and walk out of the room. Like, I can't even imagine that happening at CC, although maybe someone will tell me that it did. And I just think it's absolutely rude to not listen to other perspectives, particularly if I'm sitting there talking about the evidence base for teaching math to students who experience that math difficulty.
Absolutely, and you're an expert. I mean, I found this all sort of surprising too. I come from a math background, and so I've been to lots of math conferences, nothing controversial, nothing like this would ever happen. Only in education, I guess. I don't know. I mean, it's been surprising to me because it's supposed to, we hear people preaching inclusivity and that sort of thing, but I don't always see that, right? I think there are actually a lot of diverse perspectives are not welcome in many situations.
Very good point. Yeah. But we're just going to keep moving ahead and relying on the evidence that I see in front of me, and really just trying to help students and teachers as much as we can, and try to ignore the noise and any of the rudeness.
Yeah. Well, you know what? You're doing great work.
Well, so are you. So keep it up.
I really appreciate what you do, and I've certainly seen you put your neck out there, and I've also seen some of the bad treatment, and I really respect your work, and you have very strong principles, and you just have what's best in mind for children all the time is front and center for you, and that's very clear. So, anyway, is there anything else you want to add today?
No, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to be here. Actually, sorry I had to come onto your podcast to talk about this. There's a lot of other cool things we could talk about in math, particularly word problem solving. So maybe we'll get another chance for another opportunity that's under a more positive light. But thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for all you do in mathematics and being advocates for both teachers and students in math.
Oh, absolutely. And we'll do the word problems another day. You've been on quite a few podcasts talking about word problems. So I kind of I didn't want to duplicate their work.
But can you ever talk too much about word problem solving? I would say no. I would say no.
That's true. Okay. So thank you so much for coming on today, and keep me posted on what happens with all this. And it's been a really interesting conversation, and we'll try and get the word out there about really the research based methods for helping children who struggle with math.
Wonderful. All right. Thanks so much, Anna.
So thank you so much. As always, we've included a resource page that has links to articles and books mentioned in the episode. If you enjoy this podcast, please consider showing your support by leaving a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Chalk and Talk is produced by me, Anna Stokke. Transcript and resource page by Jasmine Boisclair and Deepika Tung. Subscribe on your favorite podcast app to get new episodes delivered as they become available. You can follow me on X, Blue Sky, or LinkedIn for notifications, or check out my website, annastokke.com, for more information. This podcast received funding through a University of Winnipeg Knowledge Mobilization and Community Impact Grant funded through the Anthony Swady Knowledge Impact Fund.